west. Roger, stand by, we're popping smoke. Look for the smoke, it's gonna be a red smoke. It's gonna be a red smoke.
Okay, got the red smoke.
Roger, gun runs, north and south, west of the smoke, west of the smoke.
Okay, copy, west of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. Commander's initials, Bravo, go.
Okay, copy that. I am visual the smoke. I'm gonna keep my fires west of the smoke and west of the road.
Roger, I see you. Come on with it, man. Give it to me. I did it. You're cleared hot.
Copy, cleared hot.
Hill, I need you. Come on, Hill.
I'm hit hot from the north.
Hill, same spot. Look for me. Keep him west.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that little cinematic I put together. As you can tell, today we'll be taking a look at the A10A Thunderbolt 2, but it won't be just one version, but instead we'll be looking at both the early and late version, both of which can be found in the American tech tree. So strap in, because this is going to be a long one as we dive in to see what these planes are capable of. The history of the A-10's development is heavily intertwined with the argument between the Air Force and the Army surrounding the Close Air Support, or CAS, mission. When the Air Force first split from the Army and became its own branch in 1947, one of the missions it was tasked with was providing CAS to the Army. However, this mission would quickly fall by the wayside as the Air Force heavily focused on their capability to drop nuclear bombs and their fighter force. This would come back to bite them when the Korean War began and it became obvious that the Air Force had nothing specifically built for the task. Instead, the new era of jet fighters and older piston engine fighters that were still around were pushed into the role, but proved unsatisfactory. So seeing as how the Air Force couldn't fulfill that role, the Army began searching for its own solution. In 1958, the Army acquired 3 Cessna T-37As on a 1-year trial period to evaluate their performance in the CAS role. This royally ticked off the Air Force, who saw this as an attempt to encroach on one of their missions, and they quickly squashed the attempt by the Army. So, in 1959, the Army returned the planes and stopped their pursuit of their own CAS aircraft, at least for the time being. However, increasing American involvement in Vietnam would show that not much had changed since Korea. Instead, they had even gotten worse. Supersonic fighters and bombers like the F-4, F-100, and F-105 proved terrible in the CAS role. They had poor handling at low speeds and low altitudes. The high speeds they needed to fly at made it difficult to spot targets on their own, and they had a limited loiter time due to their high fuel consumption. The poor performance of the Air Force's jets forced them to adopt Old Navy A-1 Sky Raiders to perform the role of CAS. Seeing that the Air Force still couldn't provide them the CAS they needed, the Army, with support of Secretary of Defense McNamara, once again began looking at acquiring a fixed-wing aircraft of their own to provide CAS for their heli-borne infantry. Through the 1960s, the Army would test out several planes and helicopters to fill this role. Some of those planes being the N-156F, a prototype F-5, the Navy's A-4 Skyhawk, the Italian G91R3 Fiat, and the Hawker Siddeley P-1127 Kestrel, an early prototype of the Harrier. As you can imagine, the Air Force was not happy with this, but by 1966, they couldn't really ignore the fact that the CAS role needed to be filled. So that year, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Air Force Chief of Staff, and the Army Chief of Staff held several meetings and came to a settlement known as the Red Leaf Agreement that stated the Army was able to provide fire support for its units with rotary wing aircraft, while fixed-wing aircraft remained the exclusive prerogative of the Air Force. Following the Red Leaf Agreement, and seeing as how the Army's AH-56 Cheyenne program was looking like it would enter production soon, and wanting to avoid losing some of their budget to pay for this acquisition, the Air Force would finally make their move. In September 1966, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, General John P. McConnell, would order a specialized CAS aircraft be designed, developed, and procured. This was the start of the Attacker Experimental or AX program. Studies began on what the new aircraft's capability should be. From these studies came 5 main design points. 1. It must be able to quickly respond to support calls from the Army. 2. It must have the lethality to take out a wide range of targets while being accurate enough to avoid collateral damage. 3. It must have a high degree of survivability against modern SAMs and AAA. 4. It needed to be simple to maintain with few high-tech systems that required specialized personnel to maintain. And finally, 5. It needed to be cheap. With these factors in mind, the Air Force began ironing out design specifications. In 1967, they would send out information requests to 21 different defense contractors to help iron out these specifications. In May of 1970, the Air Force had decided on what they wanted and sent out requests for proposals to 12 different aircraft manufacturers to enter into a design competition. The new designs were to have a combat radius of 250 miles, a cruising speed of 275 knots, include a 30mm rotary cannon, be able to carry 16,000 pounds of ordnance, be able to operate from a 4,000-foot runway, use 2 turbofan jet engines, have a high level of maneuverability under 1,000 feet, and have a unit cost of no more than $1.4 million. 2 companies would emerge as the main competitors: Northrop with their YA9 proposal and Fairchild Republic with their YA10. 2 of each prototype were ordered so they could compete in a fly-off to determine the winner. The YA10 was the first prototype in the air, making her maiden flight on May 10, 1972. The YA9 followed shortly after on May 30th. The second of each prototype was delivered in August, and the competition began. While both planes proved remarkably similar, the YA-10 won out as the rear-mounted engines allowed for more hardpoints under the wings, the ability to rearm while the engines were still running, less chance of FOD damage, and it was preferred by the test pilots. However, it would be some time before full-scale production could begin, as Fairchild was not in a position to start cranking out the huge numbers of aircraft the Air Force wanted. While Fairchild was reorganizing their company, another competition was held between the A7 and the YA-10, as some senators pushed for a cheaper option that was already in service and could do the job. However, proposed upgrades to the A7 would ultimately negate the price advantage, and the YA-10 proved the better of the two in their competition, so the YA-10 remained alive. Full-scale production finally began in February 1976 under the designation A10A. A total of 713 A10As would be built by the time production halted in 1984. As the A10As started rolling off the production line, a series of fatigue tests were conducted to see if the new plane could meet the 6,000 planned flight hours of service life. The A10 made it about 80% of the way through testing before it finally failed, requiring work to fix those problems that were found. As soon as these were fixed, a new requirement for an 8,000 flight hours of service life was put forward, requiring more testing, which it again failed, requiring even further fixes. The fatigue problem would continue even after this, as it was soon realized that the fatigue suffered by the fleet in service at the time was more than anticipated, leading to a whole new series of testing named Spectrum 3. From these tests, the main problem was found to be the thin skin on the wings, which required thicker skin to replace it. Hopes of the effectiveness of the gun in the anti-tank role were also not looking good after a live-fire test against M47s in 1979 showed that the GAU-H struggled to land a killing blow, and that the 2 that were declared destroyed in the test were mainly down to luck. The M47 was the rough equivalent of the T-55 in these tests, so the testers figured that up against the more modern tanks like the T-72, the gun would be next to useless. Not all was bad news though, as in 1978 the PAVE penny pod was added to the A-10. This gave it the ability to spot targets illuminated with a laser designator, allowing it to employ laser-guided weapons. It also received an inertial navigation system in the early 80s. Still, even with these upgrades, the future of the A-10 was not looking too bright as the 90s rolled around. However, perception of the A-10 would take a drastic swing in 1991 during the Gulf War. A mixture of 140 A-10As and OA-10As, a forward air control version of the aircraft, were deployed during the war. The plane would prove itself a capable attack platform during the war, scoring a claim to 900 armored kills, 1,000 trucks destroyed, 900 artillery pieces destroyed, 2 helicopter kills, and a couple hundred military buildings and installations destroyed. The A10 also boasted one of the highest mission capability rates of all US aircraft, sitting at 95.7%. This showed that it was easy to maintain and any damage it did suffer could be quickly repaired. Though it did shoot tons of 30mm ammo, the main weapon of the A10 during the war proved to be the AGM-65 Maverick, with the A10 having fired 90% of all Mavericks used during the war. This was because most A10 missions were conducted between 15 to 20,000 feet to avoid Iraqi anti-aircraft guns, leaving few times the A10 could actually get close enough to the ground to use its gun. Flying so high made it difficult to spot and identify targets on the ground, leading to many A10 pilots to carry binoculars with them on missions. This difficulty in identifying targets would lead to one of the more infamous blue-on-blue incidents in the A10's history, when 2 A10 pilots mistook British Scorpions for Iraqi trucks. Each A10 fired 1 Maverick, destroying 2 Scorpions in total and killing 1 British soldier and wounding 4 others before they were called off. Despite this setback, the A10 had now secured its future after the impressive showing in the Gulf War. Future upgrade programs would be pursued to improve the A10's target identification capability, but this is a story for another time, so let's move on and take a look at the plane in WarThunder. The A10 gets a full ballistics computer, meaning it has CCIP for the guns and rockets, and the bombs have both CCIP and CCRP. Since it can use CCRP, it also has the ability to place a SPI from the third-person view, which can then be used to slave your Mavericks to. It also has access to an IRST auto tracker, which I assume is referring to the Pay Penny pod. At the moment, this doesn't do anything, as the A10A doesn't have access to laser-guided bombs, and there is nothing with a laser designator to paint a target for the Pay Penny to spot in the first place. One unique feature that the A10A has that other planes don't is that the pilot gets access to NVDs, making it the first plane in WarThunder with such a feature. It can come in handy during Night Forces ground battles, but in ARRP there isn't much use for it at the moment. For defensive avionics, the A10A gets an AN/ALR-69 RWR. It's a very good RWR and it'll tell you the exact direction you're being locked from, making it fairly easy to find and spot the person that's targeting you. Then when you see a missile sent your way, you can use some of your flares to decoy them, and the A10 gets a ridiculous 480 countermeasures, so it's pretty much physically impossible to run out. Well, I mean, I guess you could if you decided to drop like 50 countermeasures per missile, but that really isn't needed as the A10 doesn't use an afterburner, meaning it's a lot easier to decoy missiles with your flares. Now before we jump into the weapons section, I wanted to take a minute to mention the new custom loadout mechanic. The A10As were some of the first planes to receive the new feature, and its delay is the reason I waited so long to review them. Now the mechanic is pretty simple to use. All you have to do is go into the secondary weapons menu, and along the bottom you will see a button labeled Create. You click on this to create your new loadouts. This will bring up a menu with a highlighted box for every pylon you have. Simply right-click on one of these boxes and a drop-down menu will appear showing you every weapon that can be mounted to that pylon. Then all you have to do is just select one of these options and it will mount it to the pylon. Then just repeat this on every other pylon until you've built your loadout. You are able to create asymmetrical loadouts, but the game allows only a 1,000 kilogram difference between the wings. If you exceed this, a red pop-up message will appear on the bottom letting you know how much weight you need to add to the other wing to make it a valid loadout. Once you have your loadout built and it's valid, you can give it a name using the rename button, or save it as is using the save button. The new loadout will then appear at the bottom of your secondary weapons menu, so all you have to do is scroll down and select it to equip it. The new preset actions button on the bottom left will pull up a menu that gives you the option to either rename, edit, copy, or delete one of your loadouts. And that's it. Pretty simple, huh? Moving on to the air-to-ground weapons, the late version gets access to the Mark 82 and 84 dumb bombs, Hydra rocket pods, and the AGM-65D Maverick, while the early gets access to the same dumb bomb and rockets, but instead of the AGM-65D, it has the AGM-65B, and it also has access to the GBU-8 guided bomb. We'll start off by looking at the dumb ordnance. You can be fairly accurate with them thanks to the ballistics computers on the plane, The bombs work just fine for knocking out tanks, but the Hydra rocket pods work better against soft-skin IFVs and SPAs. What really surprised me was the lack of a Mark 83 1,000-pound bomb option. It would have given you the option to mount something stronger than the Mark 82 without taking the performance hit from carrying the Mark 84s. Next, we have the GBU-8 Hobo. This is a Mark 84 2,000-pound dumb bomb that has had an electro-optical guidance system attached to it to turn it into a precision weapon. This is a freefall weapon, so its range depends entirely on your altitude and speed, and since the A10 really isn't known for its speed, that means you'll have to get fairly close to use it. Good thing the GBU-8 can track a moving target, so after you drop it, you can forget about it and move on to your next target. And last, we have the main anti-tank weapon of the A10, the AGM-65 Maverick. The early gets the B version, which uses an electro-optical seeker that gives you a white and black TV view along with a zoom function, while the late gets the D version, which uses an IR seeker, so it gets a thermal view alongside the TV and zoom function of the B. You can toggle to the thermal view using the Switch NBD mode keybind. The thermal view makes it a lot easier to spot targets from far away, as the zoom function isn't the greatest on either of these missiles. While I haven't tested it, the D does feel like it tracks a bit better from further away than the B will, but don't hold me to that. Apart from the seekers, the missiles have the exact same stats. Both have a heat warhead that can pin 830mm of armor, a max range of 14 miles, and a top speed of Mach 0.9. So they're slow missiles that'll one-shot an MBT 9 out of 10 times and have very good range. Though if you want to take advantage of that range, you will need to have some altitude and speed. The Maverick does have its own motor, but that will only burn for a couple of seconds. That means it relies heavily on the launching aircraft if you want to reach that max range. From my experience, if you're between 300 and 325 knots, your altitude -4 will give you a good estimation of your range. So say you're at 10,000 feet, you'll be able to hit a target that's about 6 miles away. One last thing to keep in mind is that the Mavericks are mounted at an angle pointing toward the ground. So say you're trying to fire at a close range target that's between 1 and 1.5 miles, and you have your gun crosshair pointed on them when you launch the Maverick. What'll happen is the Maverick will launch towards the ground first and then have to correct up to hit the target. This will cause it to miss most times, so to avoid this, be sure to aim a few degrees above the target before you launch so the Maverick has a near straight shot to the target. For air-to-air missiles, both versions of the A10A get the AIM-9L. The difference being the early only gets 2, while the late will start off with 2 stock, and then after researching the rank 4 modification can mount up to 4. This missile is basically a 9G on steroids. It is an all-aspect IR missile that can pull 30 Gs and has a max range of 11 miles. The Seeker has an all-aspect lock range of 1.86 miles, so it's fairly easy to get a 2+ mile lock on someone who has a hot afterburner or if they're side on to you. Thanks to the long burn time of the AIM-9L, you can hit targets that are 2 to 3 miles away from you. Though the stat card says it can pull 30G, it doesn't quite pull as hard as an R60, and I think that has to come down to the rocket motor being a lot stronger on the AIM-9L compared to the R60. So the 9L will reach its top speed faster, meaning its 30G pull is a lot less than the R60's 30G pull. This is a very powerful missile for 9.7 and 10.0, but it is bugged at the moment. The missile currently overleads its target at launch, and then when it gets closer, it'll try to correct, which can cause a miss. This causes the missile to have a tough time hitting fast-moving targets that are perpendicular to it. The devs have acknowledged this bug's existence and are working to fix it, and when it does get fixed, it'll become a much more reliable missile. Though it'll still be prone to flares like all other IR missiles even after that fix. Moving on along, it's time we talk about the gun. This gun being the SUU-23A M61 gun pod found on the A10A early. This gun pod has 12,000 rounds of ammo, and with a fire rate of 6,000 rounds per minute, you're looking at a trigger time of 12 seconds. And you can mount up to 2 of these. This will result in a stupid burst mass of 66.92 kilograms. While this is great for vaporizing aircraft and helicopters as well as light-skinned vehicles, the M61s aren't going to do anything except annoy an MBT, and that's because they can only pin 53mm of armor at point blank. However, that is far less of an issue for the GAU-8 Avenger mounted in the nose of the A10A. This giant 30mm rotary cannon has access to 1,174 rounds of ammo, and with a fire rate of 4,200 rounds per minute, you'll have a trigger time of 16.7 seconds. This massive round is able to pin about the same thickness of armor as the M61's at 2 kilometers, with its max pin being 102mm at 10 meters. Despite this improved penetration, you will still need to come in for top-down or rear strafing runs, as heavier MBTs like the Leopard 2s, Challengers, and Russian T-Series tanks generally have enough side armor to resist the GAU-8. The gun is also not the most accurate, having a pretty large spread when targeting anything over 3/4 of a mile. Overall, the gun is probably a bit overhyped, but you can still kill tanks with it, and you get plenty of ammo to rack up a bunch of kills if you're unchallenged in the air. Now it's time to talk about the stock grind, and oh boy, is it rough. Well, that's if you have the late version. The early is a premium, so if that's the one you have, you don't have to worry about this, as you get all the mods unlocked from the start. As for the late, you'll be starting off with 2 AIM-9Ls and your gun. You can definitely get plenty of ground target kills with your gun if you aim well and conserve your ammo. The problem is you are the slowest plane at your BR and you don't have flares at the moment, which makes it very difficult to survive long enough to get the ground kills or air kills you will need to progress to getting your flares. Now, after you get the countermeasure mod, I would suggest going for the Hydropod next and then focusing on performance mods until you can unlock the 9L modification. Now, I would avoid using the rocket pods until you get the 9L mod because you need both modifications to mount both the 9L and rocket pods at the same time. And in my opinion, giving up your 9Ls for rocket pods is not worth it, as you'd be giving up your best self-defense weapon in exchange for more ground strike capability. Like I said earlier, the gun is already good enough for taking out ground targets, so you don't really need the extra ground strike capability. The only reason I suggest going for the Hydras early on is so you can unlock the Mavericks immediately after you unlock your 9Ls. Once you get those two mods, it's up to you whether you want to finish it off with more performance modifications or go for the other ordnance mods. The A10A is powered by two General Electric TF34 GE100A turbofan jet engines. Despite not having an afterburner, these engines still produce a respectable 4,040 kilograms of force. Though they can generate a fair amount of power combined, don't expect to be going anywhere fast, as this plane will top out around 350 knots. You can exceed this speed by diving, but thankfully you'll have to worry more about compression than ripping your wings. When I was testing the wing rip speed, I hit 475 knots in a dive from 30,000 feet, and I still couldn't even manage to redline, much less rip my wings off. In an actual game, it's very unlikely for you to even reach 30,000 feet in the first place, since the A10A isn't the best climber. I mean, it only has a climb rate of 5,000 feet per minute before you even add any ordnance onto that. So if you want to climb, it's gonna take some time. However, it does have a very good horizontal turn radius, since it was designed to make tight turns at low altitude. Acceleration is a little on the slow side. I mean, there's no way you're going to be keeping up with afterburning jets, but even against same-tiered non-afterburning jets, it's a little slow. Its energy retention is also poor, being you can't get much energy to begin with, only being able to get up to around 350 knots, but any of that speed will be gone within a couple turns. And God help you if you try to do a vertical turn, you'll die out before you even make it all the way around. Overall, the flight performance of the A10 is by far the worst at its BR. So, with this poor performance, how are you supposed to play the A10? Well, this is really going to come down to what game mode you're in and what your loadout is currently. Now, you can make purpose-designed loadouts for both air RB and ground RB, but I like to stick with the general purpose loadout that I came up with. This consists of 4 AIM-9Ls for self-defense, 6 Maverick Ds to be used against MBTs and SAMs in ground RB, or light pillboxes and planes in air RB. The Maverick can be very useful in forcing your target to burn through flares, as they don't know you're not shooting a 9L at them right away. So against planes that have few flares at this BR, you can actually make them run out, and then you can swap to your 9Ls afterwards and shoot them down with that. Then I've got 2 Mark 82 dumb bombs, and these work well for killing any kind of ground targets. And finally, I wrap it all up with 4 pods of Hydras to kill light armored targets. Now that I've explained my loadout, let's go over how I like to play in ARB. Here, I generally like to stay low to the ground after takeoff, though I may do a little bit of climbing so I can fire my Mavericks from a little bit of distance, but I usually don't climb more than 8,000 feet. When the game starts, you need to see which way your fighters climb and follow them. Usually this will be to the left of the airfield, but it could change, you never know. They're going to outrun you and outclimb you, but you want to try to stay as close to them as possible as they can bail you out of trouble, because you are definitely going to be getting into trouble. With its poor flight performance, you're at the mercy of any enemy fighter coming after you. For that reason, you need to be constantly checking above and behind you early game, as generally 1 or 2 fighters are going to come try and take a pass at the A10s. Once you spot them, see if you can force a head-on and try to throw a 9L or Maverick at them. If you're not able to force a head-on, you're just going to have to dodge their attack run and try to force an overshoot. If you're able to drag it into a dogfight, stick with either horizontal or diving turns. Avoid the vertical like the plague, unless you are absolutely, and I mean completely, 100% sure there is no one else anywhere around you, and even then, you need to be sure that that move will result in you killing your target. That's because you will lose all of your energy you built up trying to pull this maneuver, leaving you at a complete disadvantage if the fight continues, or an easy target for a third party. Any dogfight you get into is going to boil down to how well you defensively fly as you wait for your opponent to make a mistake, or by having a teammate come in and bail you out. You just don't have the performance to force a fight on your terms or run away from one you don't want. Once it's relatively safe, you can then proceed to ground pounding. 2 fully loaded A10 should be enough to end the game on tickets if they get the freedom to ground pound. Try not to tunnel vision too much though when ground pounding, as it can lead to someone sneaking up to you and killing you. It's happened to me plenty of times when I was recording footage for this video, so just keep that in mind. Now, ground RB is a different beast entirely. For one, you need to get enough SP to call in your A10, and if you're bringing guided ordnance like the Mavericks, that's gonna get expensive. My general purpose loadout ends up being around 995 to the low 1000s SP range. The early can get even more expensive if you bring a loadout with 2 GBU-8s and 6 Mavericks. There was a Reddit post about a month ago showing the SP cost of 1113 for that exact loadout in a full up tier. So in down tiers you're probably looking at an SP range of 12 to 1300 to call it in. So it's not going to be the easiest thing to get into the battlefield. You'll generally need to get a cap and 2 to 4 kills with an MBT to get that much SP, which is doable with the 10.0 Abrams, as I've done it a bunch myself. Once you get the required SP and spawn in, go ahead and start climbing. I like to get up to around 10,000 feet so I can launch Mavericks between 6 to 4 miles away from the battlefield. Your first targets are going to need to be the Spags and Sams of the enemy team that usually like to sit in their spawn. Spotting them is going to be a lot easier in the late as you get thermals thanks to the Seeker on the Maverick D. You're going to generally have to get closer if you're using the early, as the TV Seeker and zoom view on it with the Maverick B just isn't that great. What I like to do is keep flying in circles up at 10,000 feet and shooting off Mavericks from that 6 to 4 mile range until I kill all the AA or run out of Mavericks. Then I'll start closing the distance to get kills with my rockets, bombs, and guns. Remember, with the Gal 8, you want to come in from either directly above or behind an MBT for the best chance at killing them in one pass. As you saw in the opening cinematic, I didn't do much to those Russian T-Series that were side-on to me, and only managed to get that 1 kill because I set a fuel tank on fire and the guy didn't have FPE, since he was in a stock tank. Once you're in close, be very careful of Revenge Spa popping up and trying to kill you. If one shows up, get as low as you can and run away. If you still got a Maverick, you can spin around and pop up and send the Maverick his way, but if you don't, it might be best just to run back and go get more. Though you're likely to also die with such an action if you even manage to get him in the first place. If played well, you can wipe out up to half the enemy team in a few minutes. And if there's more than one A10, you can end the game real quickly. So for the amount of power you hold, I think the amount of SP required to call in the A10A is pretty fair. One thing to remember in any game mode is that the myth of the A10's invincibility that it's built up is just that, a myth. You do have the famous titanium bathtub and some bulletproof glass on the front windscreen, but that's only rated against Russian 23mm cannons, and that's only around the cockpit. So while your pilot might have some armor to protect him, the rest of the plane doesn't have any. So modern SAMs and air-to-air missiles will gladly tear the rest of your plane apart if you're not careful. Now let's move on to the economy of the two planes, starting off with the Early. The A10A Early is a premium pack plane that you buy off the Gaijin store for $60 US. This is a rank 6 BR 9.7 plane, so it can efficiently grind the entire US air tree. It also comes with 15 days of premium and 2000 GE. This plane has a crew training cost of 10,000 SL, an expert training cost of 1.21 million SL, and an ACE qualification that can be bought with either 2,600 GE or acquired for free by getting 2.02 million RP with the plane. Very doable if you're grinding the entire US air tree. The Early gets an RP modifier of 2.26 and an SL modifier of 2.2. Since it's a premium, it also gets a ×2 modifier to both the RP and SL modifiers. It also has a very cheap repair cost of only 5,400 SL, and you don't have to unlock any modifications as they all come with the plane. Compared to the other two American Rank 6 premiums, it sits right in the middle in terms of modifiers, but it is the cheapest to repair. Now the Late is a tech tree vehicle sitting at rank 6 BR 10.0, so you'll have to grind this out the old-fashioned way. That's going to require 340,000 RP to unlock it and 930,000 SL to purchase it. Basic crew training costs 260,000 SL, Expert will require 930,000 SL, and the ACE qualification can be bought for either 2,800 GE or acquired for free by getting 1.08 million RP with the plane. The Late comes with an RP modifier of 2.32 and an SL modifier of 2.2. The SL modifier is pretty low compared to other 10.0s, but the RP modifier is average. To spade the plane will require 291,000 RP and 456,000 SL. Once spaded, the repair cost will be 13,345 SL. As far as skins go, I'm not the biggest fan of the in-game skins for the A10A. The Late gets a basic all-gray camo, which not alright, I guess. It then gets a GE tricolor camo that's alright, but I'm not the biggest fan of that dark gray with the two greens. It then gets a marketplace skin that is a gray camo with a black lightning bolt down the sides. This one actually looks pretty good, and for 70 cents, which is what it's going for on the marketplace right now, it's something I might pick up in the future. As for the Early, its default skin is basically the Late's tricolor skin with a shark mouth and eyes on the front and a lighter gray. Honestly, I'm a really big fan of this skin, and I wish this was the tricolor we got on the Late. Ultimately, I went to the WarThunder Live and picked up a couple skins that I've been using in the background footage. I'll leave the link to those in the description if you're interested. Moving over into the cockpit, oh boy is this one fun to fly from. You've got great visibility to your front, sides, top, and rear, making it pretty easy to spot targets on the ground or targets in the air. The instruments are also well laid out. Starting off on the left, we have our clock. To the right of that is our angle of attack indicator. Above that is the backup pitch ladder. To the right of that is your RWR, and below that is your speed gauge with hundreds of knots around the outside and tens of knots on the small dial in the middle. In the center at the top, we have our artificial horizon, and below that is our compass. On the right side top, we have our climb indicator. Below that is our altimeter. On the bottom are the engine gauges, and to the top right is a TV display that will allow you to aim either the Mavericks or GBU-8 from the cockpit. If neither of these weapons are mounted, the TV won't turn on. Moving up towards the HUD, we can find our G gauge on the left and a backup magnetic compass to the right. Now looking at the HUD itself, working from left to right, we have our speed displayed in the middle. In the center of the HUD, we have our pitch ladder, the gun crosshair, and on the bottom we have a compass. On the top right middle, we have an altimeter, and below that is our pitch indicator, and further down we have a radar altimeter. Some of the interesting features on the HUD include a range indicator for the Maverick crosshair. So once you lock something up with the Maverick, it'll display the range in miles below it. When in air-to-ground gun mode, the crosshair will display a range counter in the middle that will unwind from 2.2 miles, as well as displaying the range below the crosshair. When warming up the 9L, a circle will appear to help you aim, and after you get a solid lock, it'll stay fixed around the locked aircraft. Overall, this is a really fun cockpit to fly from. Alright, I think that about covers everything I wanted to say, so let's go ahead and wrap up this long video with the pros and cons and then end with my final thoughts. Starting off with the pros, the AIM-9L is a good missile for self-defense and will only get better once the bugs with it are fixed. Then for air-to-ground, you get the amazing AGM-65D. Well, that's at least if you have the late. The B is still alright on the early, but the thermals on the D just push it to that next level. Moving on to the next one, you literally have over 200 more countermeasures than the next closest plane, that being the Jaguar. I mean, you've got enough flares to dodge an entire team's worth of missiles on you. Then to round it all out, you have the GAU-8 Avenger that gives this plane its signature BRRRRRT that it is known for, which is definitely a blast to use. Moving over to the cons, by far the biggest is the A10A's poor performance. The low top speed, terrible climb rate, and low energy retention all combine to leave you a sitting duck for any supersonic fighters you come up against. Next, something I didn't mention earlier is that the engines like to overheat when you leave them on 100%, but it's not that big a pain as all you have to do is drop it down to 90 or 80% power and let them cool off before returning to full power. And this last one needs a little bit of explaining. I'm really unimpressed with the number of options we have for air-to-ground weapons. All the tech tree one gets is 2 types of unguided bombs, rocket pods, and the Mavericks. Just 4 options, and the early isn't much better with just the extra option of a guided 2,000-pound bomb. I get that the LGBs can't really be a thing right now as the A10A can't laze for itself, and cluster bombs aren't a thing yet. However, we could have still gotten the Mark 83, and the A10A can also carry the Mark 77 napalm bombs that'll be coming in the next update, so hopefully we could see those on it as well. As for my final thoughts, I'd say the A10s are monsters in ground RB, but setting ducks in air RB. If I had to pick which is the better of the two, it'd be an easy vote in favor of the late. The 2 extra 9Ls help a lot in self-defense, but the big deciding factor is the thermals on the 65D. It just makes such a big difference when using them. So if you're looking for an A10 to get, the late is the way to go. Now if you're looking for something to grind the US tree, I'd also avoid the early. Go for either the F5C or AV8. There's just such a huge performance gap between the early and the rest of the competition that it will be just that much harder for a newer player to do well enough to grind the air tree with. While it was a frustrating stock grind, it ended up being worth it in the end, and overall I would say I've enjoyed playing the A10. Now, if you've managed to stick around till now after listening to all my rambling, I'm honestly surprised. This has definitely been a long one, but I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found something informative. If you played either of the A10s, mind sharing your thoughts with me in the comments. I'm actually really interested what other people think about this plane. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Bye.